Let's talk about Daredevil Born Again, Season 1, Episode 8. This episode is called Isle of Joy. And I want to tell you that right off the hop, I was actually quite surprised and quite pleased at what I saw. The very first scene brings back Poindexter, aka Bullseye, whom we haven't seen since episode 2? Was he even in episode 2? He was in episode 1 of Born Again. And it turns out he got put in general population. And it's a great scene because he's like kind of afraid, and then he goes in there and there's hundreds of criminals that he likely assisted in putting away just staring at him. So, yeah, that's a great way to start the episode, and also a really smart way because we're down to the final 2 episodes of Season 1 of Daredevil Born Again. I think that by now they've gotten past all of the stuff that was done prior to the creative shift. Like now I think from this point forward, I could be wrong, but I think most of what we're getting is going to be a lot more razor focused and sharpened to tell this story of how the Devil and the Kingpin reassume their roles. Because that's kind of been the story of the season. It's been told slowly. The comeback, the return, the rebirth, literally, of both of these characters now in the modern MCU. The real story, and it really starts to come to a head here, is that you've got a situation where you've got Matt Murdock and Wilson Fisk who both wear masks. Obviously, one is literal and the other's more sort of in a spiritual kind of way. Because Kingpin is the ultimate hypocrite. He knows that Matt Murdock would do a lot of good to clean up the city, but Wilson Fisk wants to take credit for cleaning up the city himself while also being a criminal. You know, in turn, sort of wiping out his competition, having complete control, having, the rule of everything. And the public doesn't know that side of Wilson Fisk as well as Matt Murdock does, because he's the one who's always questioning and almost afraid and always trying to figure out what his decisions are. You know, for example, in this episode, when he finds out that Kingpin was the one that decided to move Poindexter out of protective custody into general population, he finds out it was, like I said, it was Kingpin. And again, Charlie Cox is a great actor. The look on his face is just like, why did he do that? You understand what I'm saying? Especially since they've had a rocky relationship, but that's not really something you would expect from Wilson Fisk. And you've got this whole situation where Heather, who works at the firm, is sort of buddying up with Wilson Fisk and using her story of what happened with Muse and how Daredevil saved her. And obviously Murdock knows that Kingpin is manipulating her because he's a very manipulative guy. And he's always going to be very suspicious. Meanwhile, Kingpin is afraid. See, Murdock is afraid of Kingpin getting too much power. Kingpin's afraid of losing even a little bit of power. And he doesn't want to turn Daredevil into a martyr either. So it's a really interesting character analysis between the two. And a really smart way to evolve the characters to where we're not just doing the same thing we did with the old show. And to me, it really, I'm looking forward to rewatching this down the road when everything is out and kind of then seeing the bigger picture and seeing little sort of breadcrumbs that were left in earlier episodes to get to this. But I really like stuff like that when it's done right, when it's well written. And the show's not perfect, but they certainly have gotten these two characters down and what their motivations are. And the thing that's crazy about Vincent D'Onofrio's performance as Wilson Fisk is that he almost has this, and this is all in D'Onofrio's eyes, when you look at him in some of these scenes, man, you almost have this look of like, he's not so bad. Like there are There are parts of this where you can not only relate to how he feels about things, but you can sort of understand, yeah, this guy, he's a villain, but there's a good person in there. There is a sense of justice somewhere in there. And then he'll just go and just do something dastardly where it's like, well, maybe not. Or maybe there is, and he's just a complicated three-dimensional character. And I can tell you that, I read Spider-Man when I was a kid. Not much of Daredevil, but I did read Spider-Man. And Kingpin, to me, was never really portrayed like that in those portrayals. In those portrayals, it was more like how he was in Into the Spider-Verse. So I don't know, man. It just goes to show that sometimes a writer for television can adapt a character and actually add layers to the character that didn't exist in the original source material. Something to keep in mind. There's a very powerful scene in the middle of this episode, too, between Murdoch and Poindexter that really gave me the same vibes as that scene in The Dark Knight, the interrogation scene with Joker and Batman, the good cop, bad cop routine. Not really. And then Batman's there. And it wasn't exactly like that, but it gave me those kinds of vibes. Like, where sometimes even our hero loses control. And I like when things like that happen because it shows that these are human beings. And again, it goes back to my point about how Wilson Fisk will show some humanity, and meanwhile, Murdoch will show that sometimes he loses his, albeit temporarily, and he calms down, but, it just goes to show that people are people. Bad people do good things, and good people do bad things. And that's what makes these characters layered. And then we get to the big party scene. Murdoch is there, Heather's there, of course, Wilson Fisk is there. They kind of have this discussion where Daredevil's using his, power of super hearing to hear a conversation in the other room between Kingpin and Swordsman. Now, this is the same Swordsman, the same actor from the Hawkeye show. And I haven't seen that show since it first aired, which I think was 2020, but it is the same actor. And I could have sworn that I knew he was going to be in this show. I don't remember who told me or where I read it, but it was shortly before this show started, and I think I just forgot. And then so I saw him, and I'm like, oh, okay, like, the magic of continuity. But he is a vigilante, so Wilson knows, and of course, Wilson's got the task force. So, if you remember, the whole swordsman thing was that basically he was supposed to, we're supposed to think he was a bad guy, but he actually wasn't, and it was that whole thing with Echo, and that whole storyline. And I've said this before, I didn't see the Echo show, so I don't know if they added something to it or what. I might be lost on that one, but it was still cool to see this actor back because he is a charismatic actor. And the storyline progresses as well about how the task force is overstepping its boundaries. What's supposed to be on the surface a way to calm down murder and violence on the streets is now involving crooked cops getting too much power. So there's a lot of moving pieces going on, and this is one of those things that benefits greatly from the television format. Movies, you can tell a movie about crooked cops and vigilantes. There have been many films, many of which are my favorites, about that kind of stuff. But with a TV show, you're given more time to flesh everything out and to let things sort of take their time building up, and then hopefully crescendo at the right time for your big finale or your big moment where you move on to the next part of the story. So there's a lot of moving pieces here, and again, that's what I like about it. Is it's a story that seems to be on the path of being well structured and having a real intrigue to it, a lot of nuance as well. Now, I will say this wasn't perfect. The episode did kind of start to drag right around like maybe the third quarter of it. When Murdoch is at the ball and everything at the Fisk, party, and all that stuff's going on. It's interesting when the cop takes the guy and puts him into the boiling hot water or whatever, oil, whatever that was. That's good stuff. But then, like, I felt like it started to drag a bit with Wilson and and Vanessa and all that. I just thought they could have, like, maybe. And again, it's a nitpick. It's not like I'm saying it ruined the episode. It's just I was kind of hoping it would progress a little bit faster at this point, because I haven't read, but is next week's episode going to be the same length, or is it going to be longer? Or it's the same thing when I was covering Dragon Ball Daima. Like, obviously I don't want to judge it before it comes out and all that, but in the back of my head, I always think like time management. Is there going to be enough time to tell this story? But at least with the MCU and with this show in particular on Disney Plus, they have way more options time-wise than Daima did. So anyways, just a nitpick. I think they could have gotten through this a little bit faster. I really liked, though, the juxtaposition between Murdoch and Fisk and the women they're with, like whispering at each other like, this is gonna go bad, the heartbeat in the background. That was a very well executed scene. I really liked that. The part where Murdoch confronts Vanessa about having Foggy killed was like, dude, I don't even know what to say, man. This is one of those times where it's like, dude, the last few minutes of this episode were powerful. And like I said in previous reviews, I didn't even know, like, again, I haven't read this stuff since I was a kid, but I don't remember Kingpin's wife being like a crime lord like he was. I thought the story was that Kingpin was hiding his criminal activity from his wife, at least in some of the Marvel comics. Maybe later on, after I stopped reading, they added this layer to her character. But man, the whole, like, the woman behind the man is just as bad, if not worse, thing really was powerful here. And they're like whispering to each other, like, have you ever wondered why your partner likes vigilantes so much? Something like that. That's not the direct quote. And then, meanwhile, Murdoch's like, does your husband know? Like, they really are, man, this is a great way to take a hero and a villain and, like, two characters on opposite sides and show their similarities and differences. And that's really been the execution of this show. Then it leads to the big gunshot heard around the world, and that is the cliffhanger. Man, I don't even know what to think, but they did a tremendous job of hooking me for next week's finale. Look, this show has not been perfect. Some of the episodic stuff, in the middle of the season, maybe could have been done without. I get why they wanted to preserve it, because they did pay to shoot it, so, you don't want to trash what you paid for. I understand that. And there's stuff they can always go back to, and I don't think the show has really hit the heights of the original when it comes to consistency. But I wasn't expecting it to. I just wanted it to be a good story and a good continuation. And it's been a pretty decent story, I think. But as far as this goes, it's definitely like there's parts of it that started off slow, but it definitely has me intrigued for next week's season finale. I don't think that it's going to stay with what they're teasing, but I still want to know how they kind of get out of this and where this is actually going. This episode, parts of this episode really did feel like they belonged in the Netflix era. And that's a big compliment. So, yeah, that is it. Go see this episode if you haven't. Honestly, at this point, we're almost at the end of the season, dude. and I don't want you to get spoiled. You shouldn't even be watching these reviews. If you're in, you're in. If you're not in, why watch the reviews? You know, it's not like, oh, well, I'm not going to watch it, but I'll hear what you say about it. No, like, it's good. Not perfect, but good. Anyways, let me know what you think in the comments. See you guys next time.